this video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can build tiling and repeatable patterns and textures via geometry inside of ZBrush. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the final results of maybe something that we can build out of this. So you can see something like a tail of a dragon, some scales, something like that, or you can do scales like a fish, something like that, right? I'm going to hop on over to Photoshop and I'm going to show you some of the maps that were generated from this to give you a better idea of what we're talking about for these tiling patterns. So you can see that they are obviously these different patterns and they tile on themselves, so you can take these maps and you could basically repeat them over and over again vertically and horizontally, and you could spread this detail out over the course of the model that you have there. So with that being done, you're going to be able to get a lot of detail on a model, such as like some kind of tube structure or something like that for the dragon, or some kind of fish or some other creature that you have with this tiling pattern. You could also do this with geometrical patterns too, so you could use these for floors and things like that as well. So let's take a look at what it takes to do this. So I'm going to go jump over to Maya and I'm going to show you a special setup that I created. So you can see within this piece of geometry, it's just a square, and then this is what's going to actually hold our pattern that we have. I set this up to be something like you can think of this as like a brick pattern, right? And so you can see this offset for this row versus this row versus this row. And what we've got is this brick pattern, and it goes off the page, right? So we've got this area, this square where the textures will be. And this technique that we're using inside of ZBrush is called Nano Mesh. So there's this ability with nano meshes which will actually take a piece of geometry and it'll fill it on each one of these polygons. So it's going to draw it out, and we can control the size of it and rotate it and do a bunch of different stuff. So each one of these polygons becomes a model at some point. And this offset with this pattern is the thing that gives us that tile, because we're going to have a piece of geometry on each one of these things, and you can see how it's kind of offset like this, and it goes off the page. So let's say we draw something here and it hangs over here. If we continue that down here, it's going to do the same thing off the end of the page at the bottom of this thing too. So we'll have this repeating pattern going off the page, and inside of ZBrush, basically we'll use this square to crop it within that area, so it only sees this particular part of the model that we're working with. Okay, so I've got these two different pieces of geometry. One thing that I might tell you that is a little bit unique about this is, in order to make it ZBrush see this as a model, this is a model, this is a model, this is a model, whenever we kind of draw out and we use this as just one polygon, I can't have any of these verts split in the middle of this and touching this. So I had to build geometry kind of like this, where it free floats. It's all one model, but there's no geometry snapping anything together or welding anything together. So this is all basically like separate polygons at that point, right? So that's just one thing unique that I kind of had to figure out to make this pattern and make this thing kind of work. So I took both of these, exported those out as an FBX, and let's go over to ZBrush. And I made a new document. If I go to document and if I change this width and height to 1024 by 1024, we can get a nice repeating texture that's got a decent resolution to it. I did turn off the proportion button, and you can click resize. You might have to redraw something on the screen because it puts it in this maybe 2.5D mode. Draw it back on the screen, hit T to pick the model back up in the 3D mode, and then you're kind of good to go. So that's what was done with this here. I do have the actual geometry for this. So we've got the actual square, and let's see if I rotate this around, and then the actual tiles that were added on to this thing. So if I bring everything back, if we were to take a look at just the part of this that's the tile generator, you would see those pieces of geometry under each one of those things. So I'm gonna load up a scene file that I made, a ZBrush project that's got everything kind of all set up and everything ready to go. So let's just say file, open, and if we start off with this file that I've got here, I stored a camera for this, and it's already set to take a look at just this square area of everything. We shouldn't have perspective on. We want perspective turned off for this. And if I zoom out, you can take a look. This is the piece of geometry that I made inside of Maya, right? And if I click on this, this is just this area that we want to frame in on. So if you rotate your camera and hold down Shift, you can snap it to a view, and we want to turn perspective off. ZBrush has got this function where if you tap F, it'll frame the model. Now when it's this perfect square that we've got for geometry, and we got a perfect square document, it fills the entire document to the extents, and it does it really well. So if I turn off solo and I click on this here, and I'll put it back on solo so we can see this top part, you can see how it filled it to that square that we have, just like we saw inside of Maya, right? So it's filling it to this square right here, so what we can see, but we still have this overhang of the geometry and everything. And that's going to be important whenever we do our nano mesh for this. Okay, to actually make a nano mesh, that's pretty simple. We can go to, let's just do something like a polysphere. So I've got a polysphere right in here, and if you don't have a polysphere, you could just hit the command key to open up the light box, and you can go to your tools, and you can double click and load a polysphere in there. Okay, so this will be pretty simple. I'm going to rotate the camera view and just look straight down this thing, and then I'll tap B to open up the brush menu, and then say create insert mesh brush. I'm going to just put it on an insert mesh brush right now, and I'll do B and then I, and I'll create an insert mesh brush just to make a new one. So I want to append it to this. I'll just make a brand new insert mesh brush. Now this thing's got subdivision levels, so if I try to drag this out on here, it would have some problems with it. It'll tell me that it can't do it. We could go to geometry, we could delete lower. At this point, we've got this for an insert mesh brush, right? So I'm going to hit undo to get back, and then because we made that insert mesh brush, we can go B and then go say create nano mesh brush, and it'll make a nano mesh brush from the insert mesh brush that we had. So it kind of converts it over. So let's go back over to this tile generator thing that I made, and when it makes a nano brush, it's really like making a Z modeler brush, and you can hover your cursor over a face, an edge, or a vert, and it'll do different operations. We want to fill each one of these polygons with the nano mesh brush, so let's just hover over a face, and you can hold down the space bar, and it should already be set to insert nano mesh. So if we did a target and drug this thing out, we could say single poly, and that would just do one of those. I'm going to hit undo for that. If we did all polygons, we could click and drag out like this. And so this is going to start to build that pattern that we're looking for, right? And so it doesn't necessarily look like a repeating pattern right now, but if we went to this square right here and this tap F like that, and then go to this piece of geometry, you can see we've got everything we need to set up that tile like that. Now the simple thing is we can go to alpha and say grab doc, and it'll grab the depth information for that, and it'll build this map. From there we can go and say alpha, and we can export that out, and we can export out the alpha, and we can save it for another time, right? So this is the most simple and basic kind of setup for that. It's going to give you all the different parts that you need to start generating things. Now what I could show you here with the nano mesh, which is kind of interesting, is that you can start to manipulate this model that we have. So we can start to do stuff like let's try a change in the height, right? So we could lower it to make it kind of less, or kind of stick it out. If we go to the side, you can kind of see what's happening a little better. So you're going to do something like that, or you're kind of really flattening the thing out. If we put that at 1, we could change the length this way. If you go that way, it's not going to do too much, but we can go this way with it, and you can see what it does to that as a pattern. So that's kind of interesting. Now, the other thing that we can do is we can go to this thing right here and say Edit Mesh, and that puts us in a mode where we can just start working with and manipulating the model. So I'm going to show you within the Move tool. Let's go with here in the Gizmo, and let's go to the gear icon right here for this. There's a bunch of different deformers that we've got in here that are kind of cool. And one thing that we have is there's a flatten. So we can take this flatten and just click and drag and kind of flatten the model out that way. And we can click and drag, flatten the model out this way too, just like that. And if we like the results, we'll go to this gear icon, hit accept like that. Now I've got it set up on my interface. We've got a mirror and weld, and I can mirror and weld across the x-axis, but I could also mirror and weld across the z-axis and make sure my model's the same on the front versus the back. And when we're done with these changes, we just click off of Edit Mesh, and it'll take us and it'll put us back into that mode, and we've manipulated the objects at that point. Now I already know that we could take this rotation, and we could go rotate in Y. We could do that, or we could do an X rotation. So if we wanted scales that were going in this direction or this direction, we could do that. So let's just put it on something like this right here. Now the one thing I was doing is actually going here, instead of setting this every time and tapping F like this, you can store a camera. You do have to have perspective turned on for this camera. I put it on my interface. It actually sits within here under draw. So we've got this store camera, rename camera, and cycle through them. So I've actually got a camera on there already, and I could take the position and then just turn off the perspective and then put it here. Then that way I know I've already got this thing kind of set up to where I can generate those tiles. So I go to Alpha and say Grab Dock, and you can see we've grabbed this really cool kind of pattern that we got going on here. So that's just going to be a pattern kind of like that. If we want to go back, let's just take a look and generate one more. I'll say Edit Mesh, and they do have a tool within here for our Move tool. So if we go to B and then go to M, they've got Move Infinite Depth, and it can let you just grab whatever you're viewing on the screen, and it'll manipulate the entire object. So let's try to build some kind of pattern like this, and click off of Edit Mesh. And what I was noticing before was it was doing a different part of the model. So if I rotate this thing around, I need to find what part of this it was actually manipulating. So if I rotate it 180 degrees in Y, or negative 180 degrees, either one, I can start to see those changes that I was doing. So let me just rotate this direction. I want it to go and flow this direction this time. So I'm going to leave it somewhere like that. I'm going to go back to Edit Mesh and really try to tweak that out a little bit so we can get some kind of pattern like that. I'm going to keep going with it. So not super happy with that. Let's just try some irregular shape like that. So that could be kind of interesting. I'll just go ahead and grab the dock for that, and so now I've got that as a pattern. So from here, what I was doing, I'm just going to go ahead and make a new model, and we'll go to a cylinder, a primitive cylinder that they've got within here. Now ZBrush gives you the ability to manipulate this. If we go to initialize, we can say for the size on X, let's do 25, and the size in Z, 25. Let's do 25 and 25. Size in Y, we'll do 100 for that. Let's do 25 and 100 for that. So I want a tube that's kind of like this, and we'll do H divide. Let's do 60, and then V divide. I'll do 60 on that as well, and that looks like it's getting close to being squares. What I wanted is these to be squares, so let's try 100, and that maybe is too much, and maybe do 80. So I don't know, it's just, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm just trying to get some numbers that will work okay for us on this. And I think that'll be good. And now I want to turn this into a make Polymesh 3D, so it's going to actually make it into a piece of geo. So what I'm going to do is, this has got UVs on it, and it's got cylindrical UVs, so it's got UVs that run all the way through the length of this and up and down. And I'm going to use that to my advantage. Let's go back. I'm going to click, and I'm going to use this alpha that we made here. One thing we can do, let's go ahead and divide the model. So I'm going to go to geometry, and I'll hit divide, and it's Control D is the hotkey for that. And I'll give it like maybe 5 divisions, somewhere in there. So now if we do this thing called masking, and we mask by alpha, it's going to take a look at the alpha that we got over here, and it's going to mask by that alpha. Now the pattern for this is like really large right now. One thing we can do to help that is, let's dock the alpha palette over here like that, and we can go to modify, and we can say H tiles, and we can tell it to tile a couple different times around. So we can tile it an H like 4 times, and then on V, let's go ahead and do 8 times, and let's say mask by alpha now. So we're getting a lot more going through the pattern through here, and that's cool, but I think I need more going around in this direction. So I'm going to do like 6 and mask by alpha, and that's getting closer, I think, to what that actual pattern was that we had before. So now that we've got this, we can go to inflate. This is under the deformation area and through here, and I put this on my interface, and we can just go ahead and inflate those things out like that. Okay, so now we've got actual dimensionality to this thing, and it's looking pretty good. If we scale this thing, we can scale it. Sorry, it's got the mask on it still. To release the mask, hold down Control and drag a marquee in the viewport like that. Now we can scale independently like this and kind of scale it up. So we should be good to go for that. And now I'm going to use some deformation tools within here. So let's go to this gizmo tool, go to the gearbox icon, we'll say taper, and it doesn't like it if it has subdivision levels. So we'll go to geometry, say delete lower, and let's go ahead and taper, and I'm just going to click this bottom one and then taper it down to do that. Now if we want to change the fall off of this, we can use this right here. So I'm going to pull it in just a little bit like that. Okay, and I'm going to accept the changes to this. I'm going to scale it out just a little bit more, just like that. And the last one I'm going to use is, there's a bend curve, and you can tell it which direction that you want it to bend in. And if we hover our cursor over this thing, this is symmetrical, we don't want that axis. I'm going to change the axis, and I'm going to click and drag it to where it says 2, and now I should have a dot on the top and the bottom. The blue one here is smooth. I need to find the resolution of this. So curve resolution, I'm just going to click and drag this to 6. So that's going to give me a few different points. Now that's going to give me a a point that I can click and select and move. And I'm going to click and select this one and kind of do this. Click and move this one. Click and move this one like this. And click and move this one right here like that. So let's see. These allow you to squeeze the model if you want. This one allows you to scale it up, so you could kind of pump it up if you wanted to. Just kind of cool and interesting. So I can just pump that one up, and we do have one on the very top too, like that. And if we do a twist, you could actually twist the model. Like this, so you can kind of turn it on the surface. And that becomes pretty interesting. So if we want to hold the changes, go to the gearbox thing, hit accept. And at that point, we can put it on something like the move brush, and you can click and you can start to manipulate it and kind of just finesse the shape a little bit more. Right there, like that. Okay, the last part that I was going to do is show you could mask and we could fill with color, some stuff like that. But I don't really want to get into that too much. I do want to kind of show you that we could use an array mesh. So we can go to array mesh and click array mesh like this. This will let us do, let's do like 16 copies of this thing. And we're going to rotate it. And let's rotate it in Z. Let's do 360 degrees for this. It's going to look a little weird until we go and maybe change the pivot point on it. So if we go to the pivot point, and let's go here to, I got to find which one we actually need to move and manipulate. And so I think that one's kind of cool. I want it to kind of maybe go from the center part, so we could do something like that if we wanted. And if we pull this in even tighter, we can get something similar to what I was getting before. So you can type in a number too. So if this is negative 0.25, something like that, that's a little too close. Negative 0.4. Negative 0.5. We're starting to get an opening in there, and I think that's kind of cool. I'll turn off the floor for that and just rotate it around, turn on perspective, and then maybe do a BPR render. So just hit Shift R for that. So that's in a very quick kind of manner this setup that you can use to build these tiling kind of textures in some kind of way that you can manipulate them. You can manipulate the model, you could sculpt on them, you could do a lot of different possibilities with these patterns. I haven't fully explored things, I think, to the fullest extent really yet. I've just kind of worked with some spheres and made some scales and stuff like that, but I think there's a lot more that you could do with it, obviously for making geometrical patterns and things like that. But I think this should give you everything you need to get yourself up and running and getting started making your own patterns and making your own cool art using this technique.